In 1860, the leading families of Charleston, South Carolina held personal fortunes 4 times those of the wealthiest households anywhere else in the country. 4 times. More than Boston. More than New York. More than any city built on factories, shipping, or finance. By 1770, Charleston had been the fourth largest city in the colonies. By the eve of the Civil War, it had slipped to 22nd. And yet its richest men were still the richest men in America, their money compounding in the only sector of the economy that required no machinery and no innovation: the ownership of other human beings. Roughly 40% of all enslaved Africans brought to North America passed through this one harbor. Today, that harbor is ringed by some of the most photographed architecture in the United States, and nearly 8 million people a year come to walk beside it. This is the story of how a city built the most concentrated private fortune in the English-speaking world, fired the first shot of a war to protect it, and lost all of it. Not damaged, not diminished, abolished, in 4 years. Chapter 1. The Peninsula. In the spring of 1670, 3 English ships entered a river on the eastern coast of North America and put their passengers ashore at a place they called Albemarle Point. The passengers were colonists, roughly 150 of them, and the river was the Ashley. They drove stakes into the ground, raised a rough palisade, and named their settlement Charlestown, for the king who had made it possible. Charles II, who 7 years earlier had granted the Carolina Territory to 8 of his most useful noblemen, known collectively as the Lords Proprietors. The grant was not a reward for piety. It was an instrument of geopolitical competition, a mechanism for pressing English presence into a coastline where Spain and France also had ambitions, and the king expected a return on it. Among the 8 proprietors, one understood the enterprise more precisely than the rest. Anthony Ashley Cooper was a politician and financier who had navigated the Civil War, the interregnum, and the Restoration without losing either his head or his property, a feat that required a particular kind of pragmatic intelligence. He did not intend the Carolina colony to grow the way settlements grew in Virginia by accident, through the slow accumulation of indentured servants and subsistence farms spreading inland from a beachhead. He intended a great port town from the start. To draft the colony's founding constitution, he employed his secretary, a philosopher named John Locke, and the document they produced, the fundamental constitutions of Carolina, laid out a structured society with a landed nobility, a formal council, and a trading port at its center. The colony had legal architecture before it had streets. The first site was wrong. Albemarle Point was defensible enough, and the Ashley River gave the settlers water, but the land was low and the harbor access limited. In 1680, the settlers moved. They relocated to Oyster Point, the tip of the peninsula where the Ashley River and the Cooper River converge and empty together into the sea, and there they built the city that would remain. The harbor at that confluence was something the settlers understood immediately: deep enough to take ocean-going vessels, sheltered from Atlantic weather by the barrier islands offshore, and positioned at the natural funnel through which every ship moving into or out of the low country had to pass. Not a convenient harbor, the only harbor. Every ship carrying rice, indigo, or people to and from the plantations spreading across the Carolina interior would have to clear this point. By the 1690s, the settlers had walled it in. The town that would become Charleston. The name would be compressed in 1783. Acquired fortifications in brick, palmetto logs, and tabby, a concrete made from oyster shells, lime, and sand that the settlers found hardened almost to stone. The walls ran along the waterfront and across the landward approaches of the peninsula. They made Charlestown the only walled city in British North America. The Spanish were at St. Augustine, 100 miles to the south. The Yamasee, the Catawba, and other native nations pressed from the interior. The settlers understood that what they had built was worth defending, and that the harbor which made it valuable also made it a target. The walls were the correct calculation. The peninsula enclosed by those walls was small, roughly 2 miles long, barely a mile across at its widest. It is still roughly that size today. But the harbor it commanded opened onto the whole of the low country, the coastal plain, the tidal rivers, the inland waterways, the vast flat terrain that would be given over, within a generation, to plantation agriculture on a scale the Carolina founders had planned for from the beginning. Oyster Point was not a settlement that happened to have a harbor. It was a port that had a settlement attached, a commercial engine that happened to require houses. The model for what that engine would run on had traveled to Carolina from Barbados, carried by settlers who had already spent time in the English Caribbean and understood its economics without ambiguity. Carolina was built as a slave colony from its first day. The plantation system the Barbadian settlers imported was not an improvisation or an adaptation to circumstance. It was the intended design, the mechanism by which the 8 proprietors expected their investment to generate returns. The people who would clear the swamps, divert the tidal rivers, and plant the crops that made the harbor necessary would not be the settlers themselves. They would be people held in bondage, purchased, transported, and worked on land their labor had made productive. The city at the tip of the peninsula was built to receive and distribute that labor, to process the wealth it generated, and to send it out through the harbor to markets in England and the Caribbean. The Ashley River still runs on one side of the peninsula. The Cooper still runs on the other. Where they meet the sea, the harbor is the same width it was in 1680, wide enough to hold a fleet, protected enough to hold a fortune, deep enough that everything the low country produced could move through it without restriction. The settlers who chose that point understood what they were choosing. The harbor was not incidental to the city's history. It was the city's history, every ship that entered it and every ship that left. Yachtry, Chapter 2. Carolina Gold. The first fortune arrived from a plant that nobody in the colony knew how to grow. Rice had been cultivated for centuries in the coastal lowlands of West Africa, in the river deltas and tidal flats of Senegambia, along what traders would eventually call the Rice Coast. The English planters who spread out from Charlestown into the Carolina Low Country understood that the terrain was suited to it. The tidal rivers, the flat coastal plain, the cycles of salt and fresh water that moved through the marshes with the turning of each tide. What they did not understand was the crop itself, the flooding and draining schedule, the trunk gates, sluices cut into the earthen dikes to open water onto a field and then close it again at the right moment in the plant's cycle. The milling and the husking. The planters had land and ambition and access to labor. The knowledge was elsewhere. It came across the Atlantic in the minds of enslaved West Africans who already knew from generations of cultivation in the rice-growing regions of Senegambia precisely what the planters needed to learn. Some were sold at a premium because they arrived in Charlestown with that expertise intact. The colony purchased their labor and their agricultural knowledge together in a single transaction and did not acknowledge the second. The Carolina planter class built its fortune on a crop it could not have grown without the people it was simultaneously holding in bondage. And the arrangement was not concealed exactly. It was simply not named. The knowledge transferred, the fields were flooded, the rice grew, and the wealth accumulated in the hands of men who had not possessed either the knowledge or the labor to produce it. They came to call the crop Carolina Gold, a name drawn from the amber color of the husked grain. The name was accurate in both senses. A single tidal rice plantation could return the equivalent of a small merchant's annual income in a single season, and the planters who controlled the most productive acreage along the Ashley and Cooper rivers were, by the 1740s, among the wealthiest men in the English-speaking world. The crop required standing water, constant flooding and draining, and human labor in conditions that killed steadily and without ceremony. Malaria moved through the rice swamps the way water moved through the trunk gates, with regularity, with mechanism, with results that were entirely predictable to anyone doing the accounting. Workers died. The work continued. A continuous supply of forced labor was not a side effect of the rice economy. It was the operating premise on which every acre of production depended. Enter Eliza Lucas. She was Antigua-born, the daughter of a British Army officer named George Lucas, who had left her, still in her teens, to manage his low-country plantations while he returned to military duty in the Caribbean. She was running 3 properties near Charlestown when, in the early 1740s, she began experimenting with indigo, a plant whose deep blue dye was in continuous demand in English textile mills and for which the Crown was paying a direct bounty to colonial producers. The terrain and climate of the Low Country proved adequate to the crop. The technique was refined over several seasons of trial. By 1747, 134,000 pounds of indigo had been shipped to England from Carolina. Lucas shared her seed with neighboring planters, and the crop spread across the Low Country with the speed that things spread when the economics are compelling and the land is available. Within a generation, indigo accounted for roughly a third of all trade between the colonies and Britain. Rice and indigo, rice and indigo, rice and indigo. The 2 crops stacked on top of one another, grown on the same tidal rivers, worked by the same coerced hands, processed by the same knowledge taken from the same enslaved people who received no portion of what that knowledge produced. The British bounty on indigo made Carolina planters richer still. It grew on the upland fields where rice could not be flooded, which meant the same plantation could run both crops simultaneously on the same tract of land. By the eve of the American Revolution, the planters of the Carolina Low Country were the wealthiest men on the British North American mainland. The fortune had a precise foundation: rice, grown by enslaved West Africans on agricultural expertise the colony had purchased along with their bodies and refused to acknowledge, and indigo, multiplied across the Low Country by a teenage girl managing her absent father's land, and by the hands of the people she and her neighbors held in bondage. Not one of the calculations that produced that wealth was accidental. Every element had been assembled deliberately. The harbor to move the crops, the tidal rivers to flood the fields, the people to work them, the knowledge to make the work produce results. The Carolina planter class was the richest on the continent. The math was that straightforward. Chapter 3. The Trade. The harbor at the mouth of the Cooper River was not merely the commercial center of the wealthiest city in British North America. It was the largest point of entry for enslaved Africans on the North American continent. Roughly 40% of all enslaved Africans brought to North America passed through this one harbor. Not 40% of South Carolina's enslaved population, not 40% of the Low Countries, 40% of the entire continent's. Every man, woman, and child carried in chains across the Atlantic to what would become the United States. Nearly half of them cleared through a single harbor on the Carolina coast before being distributed inland to every colony and state that required their labor. The process had a mechanism, and the mechanism had a geography. Ships arriving from the West African coast did not sail directly to the Charleston wharves. They anchored first off Sullivan's Island, the low barrier island that guards the harbor's eastern mouth, where a quarantine station known as the Pest House stood. Captured Africans were held there, sometimes for weeks, and inspected for disease before being cleared for sale on the mainland. The inspection served the market. It protected the value of the cargo, the word used on the manifests, the word used in the ledgers, the word that described the men and women and children who had crossed the Atlantic in the holds of ships. Sullivan's Island has been called, in more recent years, the Ellis Island of Black America, the name carrying within it the entire distance between a people who came by choice and a people who did not. The main landing came on the Cooper River. Christopher Gadsden was a Charleston merchant and a son of liberty, a delegate to the Continental Congress, the man for whom the Gadsden flag, the coiled rattlesnake, the words "Don't tread on me," would be named. He was also the owner of the largest wharf on the continent for the importation of enslaved people. Gadsden's Wharf, completed in 1772, became the principal point of arrival. Between 1783 and 1808 alone, an estimated 100,000 men, women, and children were landed and sold there. 100,000 people on a single wharf, built and owned by a founding patriot whose name would become a symbol of American liberty. The men who ran the trade were not marginal figures, they were the city. Henry Lawrence was one of the largest slave traders in North America, a merchant who had made his fortune in the import and sale of enslaved Africans before moving into planting and civic life. Lawrence later served as president of the Continental Congress, the presiding officer of the body that produced the Declaration of Independence. The trade was run by the most respected men in the city. It was not a secret. It was not a scandal. It was, by every measure the city used to calculate worth, the foundation of everything. The wealth of Charleston was not held mainly in land. It was not held in ships. It was held in people. Enslaved men and women appeared on probate inventories, inherited from fathers to sons with the same legal formality as houses and silver plate. They were listed as collateral in mortgage documents, pledged against loans taken out to finance the next season's planting. They were insured. They were appraised and reappraised as their ages and their skills made them more or less valuable to the market. The rice that made Carolina planters the wealthiest men on the continent had required their labor and their knowledge both. But the trade itself, the buying and selling and financing of human beings, was its own industry, generating its own commissions and its own capital. Moving through the counting houses of Gadsden and Lawrence and a dozen firms on the Cooper River waterfront, with the same procedural regularity as any other commodity market. They were cargo at Sullivan's Island. They were inventory on Gadsden's Wharf. They were line items in the ledgers that built the grandest city in British North America. Chapter 4. The Richest City. By 1770, Charleston had roughly 11,000 residents, the fourth largest city in the colonies, behind only Boston, New York, and Philadelphia. Slightly more than half of those 11,000 people were enslaved. The planters who owned the rice plantations spread along the Ashley and Cooper rivers spent the harvest months on their land, and the off-season in town and that rhythm transformed the peninsula into something no other American city had yet managed to become: the social and cultural capital of the entire South. The wealth bought firsts. The Dock Street Theater on Church Street opened in 1736. The first building in America constructed solely for theatrical performance, not a tavern hall repurposed for an evening, not a warehouse cleared of its inventory, but a dedicated building designed from its foundations for the stage. The St. Cecilia Society was founded in 1766, a private concert organization so exclusive that membership could not be purchased. It had to be inherited. The Charleston Museum, founded in 1773, is the oldest museum in the United States. Private libraries filled the drawing rooms of the great houses. The leading families of the Low Country dressed in English cloth, spoke of English estates, and modeled their lives on the English gentry with a consistency that required enormous wealth to sustain and enormous concentration of labor to produce. Then, after the 1790s, a third fortune arrived to layer itself on top of the first two: long staple Sea Island cotton. Grown on the coastal barrier islands off the Charleston shore, its fibers longer and finer than anything the upland South produced, commanded premium prices in the textile mills of Liverpool and Manchester. Rice, indigo, Sea Island cotton, 3 crops, 3 income streams, each requiring the same foundation, coerced labor on a scale that no plantation system could sustain without continuous replenishment from the trade at Gadsden's Wharf. Picture the High Battery on a clear evening in 1855. The sea wall runs east along the southern tip of the peninsula, and the great houses rise behind it. Greek Revival porticos, white-painted brick, the long-side piazzas of the single houses angled to receive whatever the harbor sends across the water. The western light is striking those facades directly, turning the white trim gold and then amber as the sun drops behind the Ashley River. Carriages move along the promenade. A ship's bell carries across the water from the harbor, which is dense with vessels. Brigs and schooners working the coastal trade, larger merchant ships loading rice and Sea Island cotton at the wharves on East Bay Street, their rigging crossing against the sky in a geometry that means money, means Liverpool, means New York, means the whole apparatus of a city at its maximum productive weight. The smell at that hour is salt and wood smoke and something vegetal from the marshes across the water, and under it, if the wind is right, the particular sweetness of raw cotton on a warm evening. St. Michael's Church rises to the north. Its steeple, 186 feet, completed in 1761, the highest point on the peninsula, a white needle against the darkening sky. Keep that steeple in mind. It will matter later. Out beyond the harbor mouth, 2 miles from where you are standing, a construction project sits on a man-made island of granite on the shoal called Middle Ground. The federal government began building there in 1829. It is a 5-sided masonry fortification, each wall 170 feet long. Rising slowly from the water on the island, its engineers assembled stone by stone in the years since. In 1855, it is perhaps 2/3 complete, scaffolding visible on the upper tiers, work proceeding at the unhurried pace of federal construction, the whole structure surrounded by the logistics of a long job. Stone barges, mortar equipment, the small population of workers who live and labor on a platform of granite in the middle of the harbor. Its name is Fort Sumter. In 1855, it is simply an engineering project, a detail of the harbor's middle distance, unremarkable to anyone standing on the battery who has watched it going up for 20 years. The city does not look at it exactly. The city looks at the harbor, the ships, the wharves, the wealth moving outward in all directions, the whole magnificent engine of it. And the harbor holds both things with equal indifference, the fortune at its peak and the unfinished fort at its mouth. Chapter 5. The Fear. Beneath the piazzas and the private concert halls, beneath the probate inventories and the cotton ledgers, beneath every first and every distinction the city had accumulated in 180 years of deliberate construction, there was a fear so constant that it had settled into the architecture of daily life and become almost invisible. Almost. In the summer of 1822, it became visible. Denmark Vesey had purchased his freedom with lottery winnings around 1800, paying $600 for what the law required him to buy. He was a carpenter by trade, a man of skill, and standing in the free black community of Charleston, a founder of the Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church on Calhoun Street. He had, by every account, built a life within the narrow margins the city permitted. What he was accused of building, beginning sometime around 1821, was a conspiracy of a different order entirely. One of the largest planned slave revolts in American history, organized across Charleston and the surrounding Low Country, drawing in the enslaved workers of some of the city's most prominent households. The plot was betrayed before it began, by informants, before a single act of violence had occurred. Vesey was arrested, tried before a special tribunal, and hanged on July 2, 1822. In all, 67 men were convicted. 41 were executed. The city that had built its entire fortune on the coercion of human beings had been reminded, in terms it could not rationalize away, that those human beings had their own understanding of the situation. The response was institutional. The state of South Carolina built a fortified arsenal at the corner of Meeting and Boundary Streets, a structure specifically designed to suppress any future insurrection within the city itself. By 1842, it had been converted into a military college, the Citadel, a city that had to arm itself against the very people its fortune depended on, a city that had to train soldiers to patrol streets lined with the houses that wealth had built, a city that kept, within its own boundaries, a military garrison not for external enemies, but for internal ones, the men and women whose labor was the source of every dollar that had paid for every building on the high battery. Something else was happening at the same time, and its arithmetic was quiet but relentless. The 1820 census counted 24,780 residents in Charleston. The city that had been fourth in the colonies was already slipping in the rankings of the young republic, outpaced by northern cities that were industrializing, building factories, extending railroads, and drawing immigrants in numbers that made the southern port economy look, in retrospect, like a static system. By 1860, Charleston had grown only to 40,522 people. By then, the 22nd largest city in the country. Northern cities, western ports, the whole apparatus of an industrial economy spreading across a continent. None of it required rice or tidal cultivation or the system that had made Carolina planters the richest men in British North America. The plantation economy made a few families immensely rich. It built almost no factories. It built almost no industry to replace the land when the land was finally taken from it. A city with 4 times the personal wealth of any household in New York, and falling behind New York by every measure that would eventually matter. By 1856, the city had grown uneasy about the most visible element of its own commerce. Slave auctions in public spaces were banned that year. Not the auctions themselves, not the trade, not the commerce in human beings that had run through the counting houses of the peninsula for 180 years. Only the public staging of it, the visibility, the street-level transaction that occurred in plain view of the promenade and the carriages and the European visitors who came to admire the city's manners and its architecture. The trade moved indoors. A city councilman named Thomas Ryan opened a private auction house on Chalmers Street in 1856, 3 blocks from the grandest mansions on the peninsula, and operated it until 1863. The business model was identical. The location was interior. The distinction the city was drawing was not moral. It was aesthetic. In 1860, enslaved people made up roughly 36% of Charleston's population. The city also held nearly 4,000 free people of color. Men and women like Vesey had been, living within the system, navigating its margins, visible. Evidence of what the system refused to acknowledge, that the people it classified as property had every human capacity that property is not supposed to possess. The great houses stood. The St. Cecilia Society held its concerts. The rice and the Sea Island cotton moved through the harbor outward toward Liverpool and New York. The Citadel trained its cadets. The auction house on Chalmers Street conducted its transactions behind closed doors. The city looked at the harbor, at the ships, at the wealth moving outward in all directions, and managed with remarkable discipline not to look at what it had built the whole apparatus to conceal. Chapter 6, The First Shot. And then, 6 weeks after an election, the city with the most to lose chose to risk all of it. On December 20th, 1860, delegates assembled at Institute Hall on Meeting Street in Charleston voted unanimously to remove South Carolina from the Union. Not a dissenting voice, not a hedging abstention. Unanimously. the most concentrated private wealth in the country, organized by ballot, taking a step that no state had taken before. South Carolina became the first state to secede, and Charleston, which had built the argument, financed the politics, and supplied the language of states' rights for 30 years, received the name it would carry forever: the Cradle of Secession. The delegates signed the ordinance at Institute Hall, and the city celebrated in the streets. The fortune built on slavery would now defend itself by force. Keep that hall in mind. It will come back before the year is out. 6 days later, on December 26th, Major Robert Anderson made a decision that changed the geometry of the standoff in a single night. Anderson commanded a small federal garrison, fewer than 100 men, stationed at Fort Moultrie on Sullivan's Island, the same island where arriving Africans had once been quarantined before sail on the mainland. Moultrie was indefensible on its landward side. Anderson understood this, and under cover of darkness he moved his garrison across the harbor to Fort Sumter. The unfinished fortification on the granite shoal at the harbor's mouth, the five-sided masonry project the city had watched going up for 30 years without much attention, was suddenly the most consequential piece of real estate in the United States. South Carolina militia moved immediately. Fort Moultrie, Castle Pinckney, the federal arsenal. Every other fortification on the harbor fell to state forces within days, and their guns were turned on Sumter. The standoff held through the winter. Anderson's men lived on diminishing supplies inside walls that were still not finished. The city watched from the Battery Promenade. The harbor held the tension the way it had always held things. Without comment, April 12, 1861, 4:30 in the morning, Confederate batteries under General P.G.T. Beauregard opened fire. The guns came from the same ring of fortifications South Carolina had seized in January: Fort Moultrie, Cummings Point, other positions around the harbor mouth, trained inward on the federal fort at the center. The bombardment lasted 34 hours. Anderson's garrison, short of food and ammunition, returned fire when it could, but the math of the position had been clear since December. On April 13th, Anderson surrendered. The flag came down over Fort Sumter. The first shots of the Civil War were fired in Charleston harbor before dawn, and by the time the sun was fully up, citizens were watching from the Battery seawall and from the rooftops of the great houses along East Bay Street, watching from the piazzas, watching from the church steeples. St. Michael's, its 186-foot steeple, the highest point on the peninsula, the landmark that had stood over every rice shipment and every cotton auction and every season of the fortune. The bombardment was visible. The smoke was visible. The whole harbor was lit by it. The war began where the fortune had been made, in the harbor that had received the ships from West Africa, on the wharf where the people were landed and counted, in the water through which the rice and the indigo and the Sea Island cotton had moved outward for 180 years toward Liverpool and New York, and the whole apparatus of an economy that required this to continue. The fort the city had spent 30 years not looking at was now the only thing anyone could see. The Confederate batteries fell silent on the afternoon of April 13th. The smoke settled over the harbor and drifted south across the water toward the barrier islands. Fort Sumter stood, damaged but standing, its walls scorched, the flag gone, a garrison of fewer than 100 men marching out with honors. The harbor was the same width it had always been. The steeples were still there. The great houses on the high battery were still there, their piazzas facing seaward, their blank sides turned to the street, the whole preserved arrangement of a city that had just made the most consequential wager in its history. The smoke above the fort thinned and disappeared. The harbor went quiet. Chapter 7. The Siege. The fire started on the night of December 11th, 1861, in a sash and blind factory near the corner of Hazel and Meeting Streets. An accidental fire, the kind that a city built of wood and lath has always been susceptible to. And before it was done, It had cut a diagonal swath from east to west across the peninsula, consuming roughly 540 acres and more than 1,000 buildings before it reached the Ashley River and died. The war was barely 8 months old. No Union shell had yet fallen on Charleston. No enemy soldier had set foot on the peninsula. The city had begun to destroy itself. Among the buildings that burned was Institute Hall on Meeting Street. Not a building of secondary significance to the secession movement. Institute Hall, the exact building where, less than a year before, the delegates had voted unanimously, and the city had celebrated in the streets, and the South had begun its wager. The hall stood less than 12 months before the fire found it. The war that the city had started in its own harbor came back to the city before the year of its starting was out. The ruins cooled. The city reorganized itself in the space that was left. From July 1863, Union forces established a foothold on Morris Island, the narrow barrier island south of the harbor entrance, and began what became the longest siege of the war, 587 days of near constant shelling, from positions that crept steadily closer to the harbor's mouth. On July 18, 1863, the 54th Massachusetts Infantry, a regiment composed of black soldiers, among the first organized in the North after the Emancipation Proclamation, led the assault on Battery Wagner, the Confederate fortification anchoring the island. The regiment advanced across open beach under direct fire, reached the parapet, and was thrown back. Colonel Robert Gould Shaw, who commanded the 54th, was killed on the parapet and buried in a common trench with his men. The assault failed to take Battery Wagner. It did not fail to be remembered. The Swamp Angel was a different kind of weapon entirely. An 8-inch Parrott rifle, mounted by Union engineers in a specially constructed platform sunk into the marsh of Morris Island, it was built to do one thing: reach the city. Not the harbor fortifications, not the Confederate military positions, but the city itself. The piazzas, the single houses, the streets behind the high battery. On August 22, 1863, it opened fire and hurled 150-pound shells nearly 5 miles across the harbor and into the lower wards of Charleston. On its 36th shot, the gun burst apart, the barrel splitting at the breech under the pressure of its own charge. By then, it had done its work. The lower city had emptied, its residents carrying what they could and moving uptown, away from the arc of fire. The houses below the line stood largely vacant for the remainder of the siege. Servants, the very poor, and the very stubborn remained. The rest of the city lived above its own ruin line. The harbor produced one more event that the city would carry into history. On the night of February 17, 1864, the Confederate submarine H.L. Hunley, a hand-cranked iron vessel barely the length of a wagon, slipped out of the harbor and put a spar torpedo into the hull of the USS Housatonic, a Union sloop of war on blockade duty off Sullivan's Island. The Housatonic sank. The Hunley never returned. All 8 men aboard were lost with the boat, gone into the same harbor that had received the ships from West Africa, that had held the rice fleets, that had watched the bombardment of Sumter from across its own width. The Hunley was the first submarine in history to sink a warship in combat. It is still down there. On the nights of February 17th and 18th, 1865, with Sherman's army moving north through the Carolina interior, the Confederate garrison abandoned Charleston. Retreating troops burned the cotton warehouses and fired the ships in the harbor. The flames spread to buildings along the waterfront. At dawn on February 18th, Union troops marched in through the smoke. Among them were United States colored troops, black soldiers, entering the cradle of secession, walking streets their labor had built, passing the ruins of the auction house on Chalmers Street, the gutted Cotton District, the gap where Institute Hall had stood. The city that had fired the first shot to keep them in bondage received them now as its conquerors. The harbor was the same width, It had always been. The steeples were still standing. Fort Sumter sat low on the water at the harbor's mouth, its walls scorched and partly collapsed, the flag gone. A burned and half-ruined city, and the harbor quiet around it, and nothing left to defend. Chapter 8. The Abolished Fortune. The accounting was straightforward. Charleston's wealth had never been held mainly in land, or in ships, or in the rice still standing in the fields. It had been held in people, in the probate inventories, in the mortgage documents, in the insurance ledgers, in the appraisal records that fixed a dollar value to a human being and revised that value as age and skill and the market required. The men who controlled that wealth knew what they owned and what it was worth. They had financed it, insured it, inherited it, pledged it as collateral, and gone to war to keep it. And then it was gone. Not damaged by the shelling, not devalued by the siege, not diminished by the slow mathematics of declining cotton prices. Abolished by an act of emancipation that did not compensate the owners by a dollar, did not offer a transition, did not distinguish between the man who had held 50 people in bondage and the man who had held 500. Emancipation did not damage the foundation of the Charleston economy. It removed it. The rice still stood in the fields still ran along the tidal rivers. The trunk gates still turned in the earthen dikes, the same engineering that enslaved West Africans had brought across the Atlantic in their own knowledge, the same sluices that had flooded and drained the same acreage for 150 years. The knowledge had always been theirs. The labor had always been theirs. Now, for the first time, so was the decision about where that labor went. And the decision, made with the clarity of people who had been working in conditions that killed with regularity and without ceremony, was not to go back. The rice swamps of the Carolina Low Country, the standing water, the summer heat, the malaria that moved through the marshes, the way water moved through the trunk gates, were exactly as lethal in 1865 as they had been in 1765. The men and women who had been forced to work them understood this better than anyone. They found other work, they found other land. They built other lives in the low country and beyond it. The rice fields went untended. The planters who remained had land they could not work and debt they could not service, and houses they could no longer maintain. They looked for labor and could not compel it. They tried sharecropping arrangements and found the margins too thin to recover on. From Louisiana and Texas, mechanized rice farms were scaling up on flat, accessible terrain that could be plowed and harvested by machinery the Carolina tidal swamps could never accommodate. The Carolina crop that had made the Low Country the wealthiest agricultural region in British North America was being undercut on price by farms that had not existed before the war. By 1890, South Carolina's rice harvest had fallen to a fraction of its pre-war level. Within a generation, commercial rice production in the Low Country was finished. Not diminished, not reduced to a secondary crop, finished. The crop, the trade, the expertise, the fortune built on all three, gone in the same arithmetic that had taken everything else. Port traffic collapsed. The ships that had once crowded the harbor at East Bay Street, their rigging crossing against the sky in the geometry that meant Liverpool, meant New York, meant the whole apparatus of a city at its productive peak. Those ships went elsewhere. The population that had been growing, however slowly, stopped growing. Poverty settled over the peninsula. The way humidity settles over the Low Country in summer, completely, without drama, without a clean before and after, until it was simply the condition of the place. It stayed that way until the Second World War. The great houses did not disappear. They could not be painted. The families who had built them on the proceeds of the rice economy and the trade at Gadsden's Wharf did not have the money to maintain them properly, and they would not whitewash them. Not the masonry mansions, not the Greek revival porticos, not the long-side piazzas on the single houses that had been built to receive the harbor breeze and the social traffic of the wealthiest city in the South. Too poor to paint, too proud to whitewash. The phrase settled into common usage, the way the poverty had settled over the city. As a description, not a complaint. The houses stood and the paint peeled and the city froze, almost accidentally in the shape it had been when the fortune that built it was abolished. Then, on August 31st, 1886, the ground moved. An earthquake of roughly magnitude 7, one of the most powerful ever recorded in the eastern United States, struck Charleston without warning. About 60 people died. Some 2,000 buildings were damaged across the peninsula. Losses reached $5 to $6 million, a sum that would have been an inconvenience to the cotton fortunes of 1855, and was, in 1886, a catastrophe for a city that had nothing. The shock was felt from Boston to Cuba. Walls cracked, chimneys fell, structures that had survived the siege, the bombardment, and 2 decades of deferred maintenance gave way in seconds. The broke city, with no reserve to rebuild properly, braced its cracked masonry walls with iron bolts. Threaded rods driven through the structure and anchored against iron plates on the exterior, holding the damaged walls in place the way a splint holds a broken bone. The bolts are still there. The star-shaped anchor plates are still visible on the facades of the old houses, on the brick of the churches, on the walls of the buildings that line the streets behind the high battery. They were not designed to be permanent. They are permanent because nothing that would have replaced them was ever built. Chapter 9. What Remains? The poverty that emptied Charleston is the same poverty that saved it. Other American cities rebuilt after their fortunes collapsed. They tore out the antebellum blocks to make way for factories or parking structures or the glass and steel grids of a commercial district that knew nothing about what had stood there before. Charleston did not rebuild, not because its people lacked the ambition, but because they lacked the money. The great houses stood because no one could afford to put something else in their place. The paint peeled off the single houses along the high battery, and the paint stayed peeled, and the buildings beneath remained exactly as they had been when the fortune that built them was abolished in a single stroke. A city too poor to paint, too proud to whitewash, had become, without intending to, a museum of itself. In 1920, a woman named Susan Pringle Frost stood in front of the 1803 Joseph Manigault house and understood what was about to happen. A developer intended to demolish the house for a gas station. Frost rallied her neighbors, stopped the demolition, and founded the Preservation Society of Charleston, the first grassroots historic preservation organization in the United States. She was not acting on principle alone. She was acting on the recognition that the poverty-frozen city around her was the only Charleston there would ever be, and that once the gas stations came for it, they would not stop. The Preservation Society held. The Manigault House held. On October 13th, 1931, the city of Charleston adopted the first historic district zoning ordinance in the United States and established its Board of Architectural Review. It was a document about real estate. It was also, without quite saying so, a decision to treat the antebellum city as an asset rather than an obstacle, to protect what the lost fortune had left behind, not because the city was proud of the fortune, but because the buildings were all that remained of it, and the buildings, it was becoming clear, were worth money. American historic preservation as a legal and institutional practice was invented here, in a broke southern port city, to protect what its own collapse had accidentally preserved. On September 21st and 22nd, 1989, Hurricane Hugo came ashore just north of the city as a Category 4 storm. It stripped the roofs from as many as 80% of downtown buildings. the worst physical blow the peninsula had absorbed since the earthquake of 1886. The city restored the historic district rather than replace it, repaired the old roof lines, matched the old materials, rebuilt the piazzas and the high stoops and the side entry facades of the single houses, because by 1989 the buildings were not a burden. They were the economy. St. Michael's still rang the hours. Rainbow Row still stood, its painted facades the same pastel progression that every photographer who came through the city reproduced by reflex. The old slave mart on Chalmers Street, Thomas Ryan's auction house, the interior room where the trade had gone after 1856 to preserve its civic aesthetics, was by then a museum, the transaction made visible at last. Today, Charleston is a city of about 165,000 people whose economy is its own preserved past. In 2024, it drew nearly 8 million visitors and a record $14 billion in economic impact, close to a quarter of the regional economy. The single houses, the earthquake bolts, the star-shaped iron plates on the cracked brick facades, the piazzas, all of it paying back a debt it was not designed to carry. In 2023, the International African American Museum opened at Gadsden's Wharf, on the ground where roughly 100,000 men, women, and children were once landed and sold. Not a memorial at a distance from the site, not a plaque beside the original location. On the ground. Built on the exact earth where the cargo manifests were written and the families were separated and the labor and the knowledge and the lives were transferred by legal instrument into the ledgers of the Charleston counting houses, the city that had moved the trade indoors in 1856 to spare itself the sight of it was now, 167 years later, building a museum on the site and saying out loud, in the language of architecture and institution, what the fortune had been. Stand on the high battery at a certain hour, when the western light is coming across the water and the harbor is going dark. Underneath it, the mansions are bright behind you. The harbor is the same width it has always been, the same width it was in 1680, the same width it was on the evening of April 12th, 1861, when the guns opened up and the city watched from its rooftops and its steeples. Fort Sumter sits low on the water at the harbor's mouth, the walls still scorched in places, still standing. St. Michael's steeple rises to the north, 186 feet, the same white needle it has always been, ringing the hours over a city that built its fortune here, lost it here, and learned, over the length of a century and a half, to say what it had built the fortune on. The harbor holds it all with the same indifference it has always held things. The light goes. The steeple is still there.